Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plot Lines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're discussing more Tolkien. We're going to be discussing, in general, the Fourth Age, but focusing on depending on your perspective, the should have been sequel or uh, glad it didn't finish sequel to the Lord of the Rings, The New Shadow. And on to discuss this topic with me is Apostolic Majesty. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing, AM?
Hello, Connor. I'm happy to be back and happy to talk about this.
Well, first, just I'd like to ask you a question about sort of like your like what like when did you read The New Shadow, like, for the first time? Was it relatively recently for the first time, or did you venture into the Peoples of Middle-earth or into the History of Middle-earth volumes a long time ago?
I think out of curiosity, I checked it out because it is, the fourth era story. But in terms of actually sort of rereading it, I read it about 2 years ago when I was focusing on a series I did called uh, "The History of Arda." It was really going to be a culmination of talking about the Silmarillion story, but yeah, it's quite hard to thematically sort of bridge the story of the Silmarillion and come to here because it's well, I mean, I'll defer that to you. I think it's an oddity in terms of thematic structure and subject matter compared to everything else Tolkien was focused on.
Even some of the language that's discussed, or that, like, the way the maybe it's because we don't spend too much time with the Dunedain in their um, in their element, that we don't really get to hear them talk of, like, creation and, like, what they know about the first age too much. It seems sort of very different from the Lord of the Rings.
Well, I think maybe the issue that Tolkien found is that obviously the Silmarillion or the War of the Jewels is a story about the elves. It's fundamentally a story about the first segment up until the Year of the Sun is a tale focusing on basically the Tolkienist equivalent of the Titanomachy, which is focusing on the wars of the Valar, and then ultimately it becomes the fall of Fëanor and the fight over the Silmarillions and their battle in the wars of Beleriand. But then you come to Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and there's a very marked shift, not just in tone, but also in the character focus. And that's an accident. I mean, everyone who sort of studies Tolkien really understands that that is because of the anachronistic component that are the hobbits. All of a sudden, the entire focus of Arda and the focus on the entire legendarium is now centered around effectively Bilbo Baggins and Frodo. And then it seems that with the tale of the Fourth Age, you of course have the hobbits there, but really this is coming back to the story of men. And in that sense, really, you can have that as some sort of mirror image, can't you, to the story of the elves being the wars of Beleriand. But I think figured into this whole scheme of looking at the history from the point of view of the hobbits, it seems rather strange to allow them essentially to become not an irrelevant factor, but very much a background factor.
Yes, and the story is taking place in Ithilien, in 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 Gondor. Obviously, there is sort of the reunited kingdom. The Arnor has been refounded, though we don't really know much about what that looks like. Which, is kind of interesting, because we're going to go on, and Tolkien's going to say, there's not many interesting stories, at least from his perspective, in the King's Peace. And it's the one thing that I kind of feel like I want to disagree with Tolkien about this. Like, that, I think there's almost could be an endless amount of sort of types of stories in the King's Peace, though it just seems like stories he didn't want to tell, which is different than not having stories worth telling necessarily, just not worth telling from his perspective, I guess.
Well, are you looking at this from the point of view, I'm not saying you specifically, but just generally, would he be looking at this from the point of view of a thematically consistent series of stories or as an IP?
Yeah, well, it is sort of a frustrating um uh effect that modernity has had on us. And I am probably being affected by that. Though part of me is more of a desire of knowing things than, like, I'm not saying, oh, I'd want to make money off of it, like, because that's what IP is to me. IP is just a desire, an incessant amount of stories in order to make money. I just want to know. Like, it wouldn't be a question of, um, I don't know. I don't necessarily. Yeah, I guess it's hard to describe. But yes, I think the whole concept of like IP and the ever never ending story that has come about through, Marvel Cinematic Universe, which has become extremely tiresome to most people these days. Yes, that has definitely probably affected my perspective there, unfortunately.
Well, I think so. Putting that aside and wanting the Lord of the Rings universe to be host to a whole plethora of stories, obviously people have done that post Tolkien, and thankfully, I know you have, but thankfully, I've never watched an episode of the Rings of Power series, and I'm glad that I didn't.
Well,
Um,
let's just say it was so bad that, and I was busy the last couple months, that I did not watch any of season 2. Like, season 1 was enough to there's no point in watching season 2 to me.
oh, good. Well, I'm glad for my choice then. Well, just think about this though thematically as a grand story, including the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion, a large focus of it is on the elves essentially leaving paradise, defying the will of Manwë, the Valar, and ultimately Eru Ilúvatar, and establishing kingdoms in a realm where they weren't supposed to be, Beleriand, and ultimately Middle Earth. That land was effectively supposed to be the dominion of men originally. At the end of the events of the Third Age, you almost have that. It's the closest thing that these grand sort of narrative arc of the Legendarium has in terms of reaching some sort of satisfying conclusion. Finally, towards the end of the reign of Elisar Aragon, nearly all of the elves have departed, and they're going over to the kingdom of Aman. In the same way that now that Sauron has been defeated and Gandalf is returning, and obviously Saruman has been killed, it also appears that the Astari and the Ainur have also decided no longer, or rather, they've been compelled in the case of Sauron, no longer to contrive in the affairs of men and to rise up opposing towers to the will of Manwë and Eru Ilúvatar. So you can say it may be bittersweet, but in terms of looking at the Third Age as a culmination of everything that came before, what really can be said in terms of a story arc continuing on from that? Because I think this is really where you take someone like Tolkien, who has basically resolved many of the inner conundrums that befell his universe by design, and then you take someone like George R. Martin, where effectively the fantasy world becomes history, and then history becomes it's just one damn thing after another. I think that's something Tolkien understood when he was looking at the Fourth Age, and that's why he used the word possibility of a thriller. This isn't some grand fantasy epic in the scope of the Silmarillion, which would have been the New Shadow. This isn't some fantasy story necessarily. In the case of Lord of the Rings, a grand epic fantasy, or a children's story in the form of The Hobbit. But this would be something else, and I do wonder to what extent that could have evolved into a thriller. Because the ironic thing about me saying that, and about Tolkien himself saying that, is if you read The New Shadow, I don't get any hint of a thriller at all. Rather, if anything, it basically acts as a dialogue on the concept of the perpetuation of evil. It may have led to a story where you have some sort of neo-orc secret societies around the Dark Tree, and that could have formed the basis of some sort of compelling narrative moving forward. But really, the sort of interesting questions that the New Shadow and the Fourth Age bring is a case is, did Aragon and the Fellowship of the Ring win? Did effectively all those conflicts that we see resolve in a satisfying manner? Did the Third Age ending and the Fourth Age beginning result in that the culmination and the ending of all of these themes that were brought up since before the Silmarillion? If you're going to look at the New Shadow as some sort of meta commentary on that, it's interesting. But I can understand why Tolkien decided not to pursue the narrative any further.
Well, even like with based on like Tolkien's letters and the time frame, it almost seems like it pops back up in his mind relatively close to his death. Like that he's still not like, he like it seems like he's going back and forth internally of whether or not it matters or not.
I think that's the issue with Tolkien, though. I mean, one of the infuriating things about Tolkien is that the Silmarillion starts in the 1910s, it continues up into the 1970s, and it's never finished. This is something that affects everything regarding Tolkien. I mean, we really should be lucky that we actually have the Lord of the Rings. And he was encouraged, and he was sufficiently, again, perhaps cynically, financially motivated to complete the Lord of the Rings in a way, say, for example, that the publishers were not prepared, say, for example, to allow for his desired intention for the Silmarillion to come to full fruition. So that's one consideration. But I put less stock in terms of Tolkien mulling around with the idea. I mean, when it comes to the New Shadow, which are the 13 or so pages of a story that would have taken place in the Fourth Age, Christopher Tolkien notes that there were three iterations of this tiny chapter of a book that never came to be. So really, it just seems to be variations on a theme, which is this idea of evil enduring and what the nature of evil would be in the Fourth Age. But in terms of going really beyond that idea, it seems that Tolkien himself didn't have a clear conception, but as with everything else involving the Silmarillion, he was constantly taking ideas and revising and revising and revising and changing events and bringing in new innovations such as Numenor, etc. But yeah, effectively the only reason we have access to any of these materials at all is because of Christopher Tolkien.
Yes, he really has kept alive interest in his father's work outside of just the Lord of the Rings. I mean, the Lord of the Rings would have been kept alive by itself, I think, but he, even like it could have been just that one story, or those two, or The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, which is kind of, obviously they're two different stories and even two different like themes and even two different types of stories. One's a children's story and one's a epic fantasy, or epic story in general. But he is keeping alive the sort of the things that were possible in his father's head, going back and forth. Would you mind reading letter 256, and then we can talk about it?
Yes, just give me a second so I have it clearly in front of me. All right. So this is letter 256, which Tolkien wrote on the 13th of May, 1964. I did begin a story placed about 100 years after the downfall of Sauron, but it proved both sinister and depressing. Since we are dealing with men, it is inevitable that we should be concerned with the most regrettable feature of their nature, their quick, sorry, for some reason I can't pronounce that word, to be sated with good,
Is it
to be,
satiety or
yes, satiety, so that the people of Gondor in times of peace, justice, and prosperity would become discontented and restless, while the Dynas descended from Aragon would become just kings and governors like Denethor, or worse. I found that even so early, There was an outcrop of revolutionary plots about a center of secret satanistic religion, while Gondorian boys were playing at being orcs and going around doing damage. I could have written a thriller about the plot and its discovery and overthrow, but it would be just that, not worth doing.
So, would you say the reason it's a thriller is because there's not really any magic involved? There's not really any high fantastical elements involved, or what? Can you what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, a thriller is a bit of sort of a difficult sort of genre to really ascertain, because it doesn't really fit into any of the other genres sort of neatly. I think it's basically something that just keeps you on the edge of your seat, effectively. Um, Obviously, that's what the sort of most literal reading we can get from a thriller. But reading that, I really do think, or my implication from that is thinking of a Tolkien equivalent of George R. R. Martin,
Mhm.
because obviously George R. R. Martin's works really are thrillers, I would say, more than they are fantasy epics. And of course, as you know, they include a lot of low and high fantasy elements in there. And just say, for example, talking about the center of secret satanistic religion and the idea of kings devolving into governors. I mean, you can just take George R. R. Martin, say, for example, look at the cult of Rolor, or, take Stannis Baratheon, or any of these sort of figures, and talk about monarchy no longer being a concern for legitimacy and solely being about effectors of power and military prowess, etc., and dynasty as an end in and of itself. I think you can say that this is an explicit rebuttal, essentially, of what George R. R. Martin would then go on to criticize Tolkien for doing. What is Aragon's tax policy? I think perhaps Tolkien had the understanding and the foresight to realize that in the grand scheme of things, focusing on Aragon's tax policy wasn't necessarily the right focus.
Yeah, I mean, Tolkien will talk about governance, but he talks about it in sort of a higher manner. He's talking about it in, themes and in, like, I don't know, in classical ways. It's not necessarily how much is somebody taxing you, or what's he doing with money, or that sort of thing. It's much more virtues or vices.
Yes, essentially, it's, are you appealing to the will of the creator, or are you allowing for this will effectively to be subverted? Hence the two original themes in the music of the Ainur.
Is Tolkien sort of also revealing a lot of cynicism about just our world in general? He's getting us closer to our world. I think he didn't. I don't remember where I got this, but there's something about the fact that this is like we're in like the eighth age. I don't know if that's something he said, but I've heard that.
I think it's, I mean, within the scheme of Lord of the Rings, I think you're looking at the first stage through the fourth age. I mean, these are the living eras of Middle Earth, so to speak. It's very difficult to conceive of that in terms of the mortal beings before then. If you're talking about the era of the lamps and the era of the trees, etc. But something that maybe occurred to me is if this was some sort of social commentary. And I don't really want to raise this point because I think it would actually make the idea far less interesting. But whether him writing in the 1960s and him writing in the 1970s, this was actually some commentary on effectively the faddism, say, for example, of neo-Nazism after the Second World War. I don't want it to be that because it makes it seem rather dull and pedestrian, but nevertheless, that's something that occurred to me in terms of the great fight is over, evil has been defeated. There have been 105 years of peace, and now we have to deal with these discontented and young people faced with a sense of unease and ennui, and then from that they come off and they want to regenerate things that were already defeated, like obviously what Britain was fighting against in the Second World War.
Couldn't you make a similar argument in some way to communism too? Like just the continuation um, of the subversion of society by communist or Marxist ideas underneath the surface.
I think the reason why I find that quite difficult is that there isn't any great communist international. Maybe there is. Maybe that's where Tolkien was going to take the story. Maybe the deep roots of evil were going to reference something like that. I don't know, but unfortunately, we just don't have enough um, detail to be able to imply, whether he was going with that. I think there's more to suggest that this is an overall commentary, you can say, of um, the perils of basically stagnation and peace, and man's desire effectively to bring about his own world through his own agency. The era of men in Tolkien's conception is completely distanced from the era of the elves. The elves are immortal. They have their entire thousands of years, and then before then, longer years, when we talk about the years of the trees, to refine and hone their crafts, etc., and to come to a greater understanding and accord with the Valar. Whereas men are afforded agency in the way that elves aren't, because effectively they are mortal. They have to create an impact within the short span of years that have been afforded to them. And so I think Tolkien has to focus the story on men, because the elves have had their ending now. Their story has passed. They've abandoned the kingdoms of men, the kingdoms of Middle-earth. They have gone. They are now accorded what was essentially their intended fate. And now, with none of that being a factor anymore, how can you even conceive of looking at men living happily ever after under the dynasty of Aragon? And maybe Tolkien is being incredibly cynical here and saying, with all of the thematic threads that I've been, uh, placing from the beginning of the Silmarillion, maybe at the end here, really there is a futility underlying all of this. And I think you can understand that, given Tolkien's perspective, that would completely rob the Lord of the Rings of any sense of eucatastrophe. And I think he understands that, and he's wise enough to understand that from the point of view of the legacy of the story of Lord of the Rings, that is something to consider. But also from the point of view of, again, his own cynicism regarding man, and again, the idea that man is constantly degenerating. Like every iteration we have of Middle Earth from the previous generations, the previous eras, is weaker than that which preceded it. The golden age of Numenor is so far gone from any sort of realms of conception. So what we have now, even though there is peace, is so far removed, say, for example, from the first few hundred years of the Second Age. So everything is degenerating, and yet there is also supposed to be a semblance of victory and peace after the victory against Sauron at the end of the Third Age. So Tolkien is very, very uneasy, I think, to explore these topics in any greater depth.
It's interesting that Numenor is kind of the closest, or the downfall of Numenor is the closest thing we have to a completed story about men. Because the Lord of the Rings really is more centered around the hobbits. And then the Silmarillion is not complete, but far more extensive. And it is all about the elves. So there's like Tolkien never finished, or could never bring himself to finish, a story about men, because he wrote a few starts of stories. There's also in Peoples of Middle Earth, there's also the Tel Elmar, which is about the colonization of Middle Earth by the Numenorians. And then there's Aldarion and Arendis in the Unfinished Tales. Do you think just Tolkien kind of can't bring himself to just deal with men?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think Aragon's story is fundamental in terms of being able to conceive of a structure from which the entire Middle Earth can come together and rebuild. And that seems to be the commentary regarding the Fourth Age, that there can't be the Fourth Age without Aragon, without Elisar. All the other characters have, an important, impression to make on the world, but ultimately Aragon is the maker of the era. He is the reign date. He is establishing essentially the king's peace. All of these elements you can infuse here, and I hate to say this, but a lot of what Tolkien does in The Lord of the Rings is recontextualize stories that he created elsewhere. So you bring up the story of Numenor. Well, effectively, the story of Elendil and the story of Isildur is almost identical, effectively, to the story of Aragon, with one major difference, which is that Aragon enables the ring to be destroyed, or allows it to be destroyed, whereas Isildur doesn't, allowing for evil to continue into the world. Because effectively, if you look at Numenor being destroyed, what do Elendil and Isildur do? They go off and they recreate the kingdoms of Men and Middle-earth. What is Aragorn doing at the beginning of the Fourth Age? He is recreating the kingdoms of Isildur and Elendil. But obviously, because the ring wasn't destroyed, you have that carryover from when Ar-Pharazôn was corrupted by Sauron into the Third Age, because that evil, that influence over men is still there. And so again, in terms of Tolkien being able to conceive of a story for the Fourth Age, how can I, say, for example, begin the story in the First Age with Melkor? He is defeated. I bring in Sauron. Sauron looms over the Second and Third Age, but now he's been defeated, and there's no heir to Sauron. There's no obvious heir to Sauron. So how can I basically continue this story about the corruption of mankind if there isn't necessarily a devil in the story, if there isn't so much of an evil presence? And that's why if you read The New Shadow, it very much seems to almost be talking about evil more in the abstract. And that in itself is, you could say, also quite a departure from everything that we see coming before it.
Well, it's interesting because they're talking about in the New Shadow, it's sort of a discussion about sort of a satanic cult that has come about. And one of Tolkien's viewpoints about sort of the blue wizards was if they had fallen away, if they had failed in their mission, that they became sort of leaders of cults. And to me, that there's like that, I don't know, that it's sort of a revival of that idea, whether or not it comes from the blue wizards or something like that. There's sort of that potential of something supernatural that could come into the story.
Well, these would sort of be Tolkienistic equivalents of like Gnostic cults, or sort of Manichaeanism, wouldn't it?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it's definitely, it would be sort of a perversion of sort of the, whatever you could call sort of the religion of uh the Dunedain or the Numenorians, the worship of Eru in some form, which Tolkien alludes to it with sort of the king going up to Mount Mindolluin, and there being hallows on that mountain. But it's slightly unclear. But anyways, yes, that sort of some sort of perversion, or even like what is it? What's that heresy in France that it was in the the Albigensians, kind of like the Albigensians.
Yes, the Cathars.
Yes. So in some ways, was this story that was just moving towards some sort of Albigensian crusade?
Yes, but who would be leading the crusade? Because it seems that there's very little in this short excerpt that we can see in terms of enthusiasm for the new royal dynasty that has been established. So again, maybe if the story was elaborated on in terms of how the kings of Gondor and Arnor see themselves, how those kingdoms are being rebuilt, maybe that again would have been an interesting thing to consider. And again, you mentioned religion. There's virtually no religion at all when it comes to the, I wouldn't even say worship. I would say rather deference to Eru Iluvatar. But religion, formal religion, does seem to play a larger role when you talk about the cults established around Melkor, when you come to a figure like Sauron. And so it seems that the inspiration for the burning of the original tree in Númenor and the cult of the Dark Tree, it would seem that, again, as Tolkien has so much themes that cross over, that maybe this would be a much, much, much lesser version of Melkor's original cult on Númenor.
Yes, and it's interesting that they're sort of referencing the dark tree. Like that's what sort of it's alluded to as a dark tree versus a white tree, I guess. But I'm not really sure what there's no real reference to a dark tree anywhere else, is there?
No, and that's is almost what makes it interesting, because obviously for Tolkien, the white tree, it's Yggdrasil. It is essentially it is the world's tree, and it is also the root of the realms of men. Again, of course, in terms of like nationalist iconography, the oak, which is rooted in the ground, everything again is supposed to associate with the idea of the realm and the people of the land, and the continuity of the traditions, etc., all inherent in the idea of the tree. So the true act of revolution, from Tolkien's point of view, is to destroy the tree, and it is to burn the tree. And that is why in the Akalabeth, that image was used effectively to represent the demise of Ar-Pharazôn and his attempt basically to invade heaven, which causes ultimately for the destruction of the island of Númenor. So what does a dark tree in this whole context really represent? I mean, it's, as you mentioned, it's an oddity within the grand scheme of Tolkien, and maybe this represents an evolution in the overall story of the Legendarium, or maybe a direct attempt to create a counter nation to that of the realms established under Arnor and Gondor. We can only speculate, but that idea of establishing a counter nation, a nation under the will of the orcs, or inspiration from the orcs, or whatever, would fit in again with your Cathar analogy, that we're basically going to create a realm which is in opposition or even heretical to that new order which has been established after Aragon.
Yeah, and also it is implied though that the end would be, I mean, Tolkien didn't get to an end or anything like that, but he implies in his letters that it would just end with the overthrow of this cult eventually. Like that, I guess one of the reasons why, in some sense, it doesn't feel like a necessary story is because there are, it's unclear how there would be any long-standing effects, maybe.
And this is interesting, and this is also the reason why I think Tolkien played with the idea, but ultimately all he was able to accomplish is this short dialogue on the nature of the persistence of evil and the ramifications of man's idleness. Idle hands, can be corrupted by the devil, etc., or the devil's plaything. And of course, man effectively being ill-suited for long periods of peace. But I think ultimately, perhaps what Tolkien understood deep down is that in order to have a satisfying fourth age story, he needed to finish the Silmarillion. And
Yeah.
because he never finished the Silmarillion, which was focused on the first prophecy of Mandos, which is effectively foreseeing the doom of Fëanor's enterprise to reclaim the Silmarils, how it really should have ended is not looking 100 years after, the destruction of Sauron, but projecting this maybe 1,000 years after, to the end of the Fourth Age, or the equivalent, where instead it would have resembled the second prophecy of Mandos, which is Dagor-Dagorath, the battle of the end times, in which Melkor finally arrives. And in that sense, you can say the Silmarillion and Dagor-Dagorath can, bookend the Lord of the Rings, being essentially the central story to that. And in that way, you can say that Tolkien can really radically depart from his creation in the Third Age in a way that also doesn't fundamentally undermine the eucatastrophe that, oh, we've destroyed Sauron, but evil is allowed to creep in anyway. So I think that's fundamentally a problem in terms of scope. Yeah, we're looking at a small story focused around the deposition of a cult, which is representing these lingering orcish elements from the defeat of Sauron, or are we basically talking about the full realization of the Silmarillion as some epic, grand narrative beginning with the creation of the world and finally Tolkien's equivalent of the coming of the apocalypse and effectively the second coming of Christ?
Yes, which, but I don't. It's possible that he may have also just not been able to, like, get his head around maybe a, like, is Lord of the Rings in some sense kind of this world's first coming of Christ? Like,
I mean, you can that is a question which I can't answer, and I don't think that's a question that anyone can answer.
yes, yes,
My closest comparison would be Elendil, who
okay.
of course finishes off in the Silmarillion. I wouldn't necessarily see that theme as is really present in terms of Lord of the Rings, or you can ascribe that personality to many people. I mean, looking at Aragon, for example, I look at him more as a Charlemagne-esque figure. And I mean, if you're going to take a historical point of view, I mean, you can justify Tolkien's cynicism and misery in the sense that, within a few decades after Charlemagne's death, Europe was effectively back into the Dark Ages and everyone was tearing each other apart and dividing the kingdoms and all that sort of thing. But like I said, I think Tolkien understands that, he's well versed enough in terms of his own conception of man, which is obviously wedded to a Catholic theology. He has an understanding of history. He has a grand, lofty aspiration for parts of the story, at least, to refer to some sort of asterisk history of what could have been an original mythology, perhaps of England, but of something much broader. And instead, it seems with the Fourth Age, instead has to focus on something which seems far more mundane, which is effectively turning the epic, turning the fantasy into a real history, a history of events, focusing on characters without those high fantasy elements, and ultimately facing lower stakes.
Yes, and when I asked you that where was the first coming, I wasn't exactly saying it in the sense that you could give me an answer because I don't think as you said anybody could give you the answer, but I think it actually puts or shows that Tolkien also couldn't do that. I don't think Tolkien could say this is the first coming. So I'm not sure he could really do an apocalyptic story. And maybe that was hindering him in, because I believe he kind of went back and forth of whether or not Dagor, what is it? What is it called again?
Dagor-Dagorath.
Yes, whether that would actually happen. I'm pretty sure he went back and forth between whether or not that prophecy was um, going to happen, or Christopher Tolkien was trying to figure out whether or not his father intended that to come about. Because I believe some of that stuff is cut from the Silmarillion, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, there are many versions of the Silmarillion. I mean,
Hmm.
with the reception of the idea of the second prophecy of Mandos, the most sort of the latest realized vision of that is in the Quenta Silmarillion. But in terms of the actual Silmarillion we have, which is Christopher Tolkien's Silmarillion, which isn't really a Silmarillion at all, it's simply a compilation and interpretation of what the Silmarillion could have been,
Hmm.
according to Christopher Tolkien. It really is. It's not the Silmarillion by J.R. Tolkien. It's the Silmarillion edited by Christopher Tolkien, effectively. So it's very difficult to look at that Silmarillion because I'm more talking about this with the idea that the Silmarillion was a completed work, and it wasn't.
Mm.
It was a personal mythology that was never put to print, and I believe it would have been impossible, given how Tolkien wasn't as prolific in these stories as perhaps he could have been. We're looking at the Silmarillion basically being a 2,000-page long book. If we're looking at dialogue, and we're looking at character development, and we're looking at a story which spans the ages and generations of so many people, because again, it's a 500-year history as opposed to a 50-year history when we're looking about The Hobbit through to the end of or 60 years through to the end of Aragon. So, I mean, all of this is hypothetical, and what I think we're both trying to do here is tease out what Tolkien's vision of the fourth era was going to be, and why he decided to focus on this smaller story with Bolar and Ceylon and their conversation regarding the possibility of a new orcish cult and the persistence of evil, and what that really has in terms of implications going forward for the legacy of the Lord of the Rings.
Yes, indeed. Now, one of the things there's like an interpretation I think you could get from sort of the criticisms between the characters of Borlos and Ceylon when sort of and he's writing this in the 60s, and one of the big sort of followings that came about with Lord of the Rings was like the hippie movement uh, and the Lord of the Rings. I believe that many of them were very fond of the Lord of the Rings, probably because of a lot of Tolkien's love of nature and that sort of thing. But to me, it comes across as kind of maybe he was trying to criticize the hippie movement, and sort of the proper order of things, man's dominion over the earth, and sort of what is an orcish manner and what is not, how like using trees in certain ways.
Well, what is an orcish manner?
um Basically destroying nature for no real sake, outside of taking away its ripening, basically destroying the fruit before it's ripened, to just be, I think, doesn't Ceylon cut down some tree or fruit, just to use basically in his games as a child, um, a- and uh, it takes away the flourishing of that fruit, as well as the fruit from the man's garden in which he took it from.
Yes, it's really a commentary on the pettiness and the futility of evil, and the orcs basically representing nothing more than a corruption which has no higher end in and of itself. Its end simply is drawn to that of destruction of the good. And uh, uh, again, it's sort of, I brought it up earlier, but how do we read contemporary events and the post Second World War situation as informing his overall pessimism, you may say, regarding a construction of the new shadow in the fourth age? Because you bring up the hippie movement. I mean, the Second Vatican Council, the contraception, the contraceptive pill.
Mhm.
1968, we have the riots of 1968 all across the world. We have the Cultural Revolution in China. We have the Vietnam protests, all of these sort of things going around between 1965 and 1972, when we have, you know, the written records actually pertaining to these ideas of Tolkien. So yes, it is possible that Tolkien may have looked at all those events and then drawn effectively this conclusion from it. He may say, for example, have looked at the brief period after the war, and you can say the brief moment of social conservatism in the 1950s, as some cases that the peace wasn't going to be futile after Second World War, only then to reminisce a decade later and say perhaps it all was. That's one consideration to make. But I think then again, there's the meta narrative that ultimately this would be the logical endpoint for how Tolkien has written men as well. As I made the comparison earlier, you have the elves who essentially are drawn to this idea of stability and eternity, and men who have to make their marks on the world. So again, this sort of goes back into the idea of the futility of existence and evil, essentially, and man effectively, by having agency and having free will, has the choice effectively to make the wrong decision. All of these things, I think, again, Tolkien was looking at all of this and realizing that it would be thematically consistent, but I don't want to undermine the work of everyone in the Lord of the Rings.
Yes, I mean when I say the sort of the hippie movement, that sort of thing. I don't think it perfectly maps on or anything like that. I think it's just another possible um, um uh, view that you could draw upon of what it might be alluding to. And what do you think about sort of there's one of the parts of the book, or one of sort of the they're discussing kind of like the official narrative of why these sailors go missing. So like his son Borlak is a captain of the ships, or part of the ships, or has a commission within the ships of Gondor. And there's this scandal where a bunch of sailors go missing, and it sounds like the official narrative is that they were ill-equipped sailors. They weren't very bright, or they weren't very good. And Ceylon, who is sort of who like is more knowledgeable, or seems to have secret information about things, says that these sailors were actually sons of fishermen, very good sailors, and there hasn't been storms in that time. So, like, in other words, what happened to these sailors? Like, is there a larger um, problem than is alluded to in the story previously, that maybe people higher up are um, basically participating in this cult, or what do you think is going on here? What do you think this is?
Well, one of the issues I had with this, in terms of like looking at this purely from a chronological point of view, this is 105 years. This is during the reign of Eldarion, who is the son of Arwen and Elisar. The reason I have an issue with this is, if this is indicative of a growing suspicion of authority, that there isn't that spirit which basically undergirded the creation of the Fourth Age and the creation or recreation of the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. If that is already gone, it is a very depressing and pessimistic remark, because if you look at Numenor, for example, it took many, many, many more centuries for there to be that level of frustration and antipathy, and for basically Numenorian society to divide into the elf friends and the more, again, managed supremacist, etc. So on that point alone, I think if it is insinuating what you are implying, which I think is perhaps what they're also trying to get across, or Tolkien was trying to get across, this idea that things are not as how they should be. Evil is returning, but we don't exactly know how or where it's coming from. There are simply these portents, these omens that are showing. The fact that it's happening so quickly does, again, to me, allude to the fact that it is a very, very pessimistic story. And whether, again, had Tolkien had the chance to realize the story, whether he would have kept that time frame. Because, I mean, you can look at even if you look at the Third Age. I mean, it took how long? It took over 2,000 years, really, for the Kingdom of Arnor to be destroyed. So, within the grand scheme of things, it really does seem that things are unraveling very, very quickly. And again, I just come back to the point that I can understand why Tolkien decided to abandon this story.
Well, so did you get sort of that interpretation of that the sailor story the way I did, or did it come across differently to you?
No, I agree. I agree
Okay.
with your interpretation fundamentally, that it is indicative of how things effectively are going wrong. There are these portents and omens signifying something is afoot, yet simultaneously it also shows a frustration and lack of trust in authority and a questioning of authority. And all of these things are again are indicative or an indictment upon the Gondorian settlement.
Yeah, is this sort of a black mark on Aragorn?
Yeah, and that's why I found it very depressing, sort of coming to the grips in terms of what this story was really supposed to realize. Because I look at this, and I really do think it's indicative of a meta which was surrounding Tolkien and his life. I.e., am I using the Lord of the Rings universe to talk about or comment on the situation of Britain post World War II? Or am I sincerely trying to look at the aftermath and the achievements and the legacy of King Aragon? Because even in our timeline, I think if you have such a grandiose achievement, like say for example, take the Emperor Augustus. Um, yes, in our timeline, it may take 100 years to undermine faith in a idea of regality or whatever, but we're talking human years, and 100 years is, perhaps appreciate, and you can perhaps appreciate 100 years. In Chinese dynasties, they can last 200 or 300 years before you begin to have portents which are indicating the loss of the mandate of heaven. But I think 100 years is very, very short, and the fact that this is taking place under Aragon's successor does to me indicate that it is a very, very gloomy and pessimistic story.
I'm not familiar exactly what with like English history just right after World War II. Was the 1950s a somewhat hopeful time?
Uh, I wouldn't say so. That's the interesting thing. This is why I would say I see it as part of a meta commentary on Britain. Because if you look at the narrative, which is evil has been defeated, we will now go about and we will restore the kingdoms, i.e., we will restore the kingdoms which Sauron has brought bare. If I'm going to draw some spurious analogy, oh, we're restoring the old nations of Europe. Oh, well, actually, no, half of Europe's under Stalin's control. Okay, that's great. Oh, look, we've given India independence. Isn't that great? Oh, look, here's the Suez Crisis and the Malayan emergency. Oh, look, by 1960, the entire British Empire is basically, unraveling. And by the 1970s, we're going to be a complete and utter economic and diplomatic basket case. um, Maybe that context is interesting in terms of feeding into Tolkien's idea, because he finished writing The Lord of the Rings in 1949. It was published a few years later in the early
Mm.
1950s. So it's interesting, isn't it, how much of life is really informing these events and these commentaries? Because on the one hand, like I said, you can interpret this as the logical endpoint of how Tolkien has written men. Yet on the other hand, it seems to be a meta commentary which seems to undermine the achievements of his own characters in a way that seems incongruent.
Yeah, I almost kind of don't want uh like like current events to affect the creations of these stories, but it's impossible not to.
Well, I mean, a lot of Tolkien scholars like to look at the inception of the entire Silmarillion and the Legendarium as part of a trauma which is inherited from the First World War. So I think, yes, I think you can look at this and see this as part of uh, life informing literature.
Do you think what do you think of that view of Tolkien scholars that sort of it was all started by the trauma from World War One?
Uh, I think that's a rather reductionist remark.
Yeah.
And I think the issue I have with that commentary is that it basically blends into this whole anti-war narrative that all of these great writers supposedly all suffered from. They suffered trauma, therefore war was bad. Tolkien never explicitly is anti-war at all. He is completely fine with the idea of a justified conflict, which is thoroughly Christian. He is not in any way a pacifist. He is traumatized by war, yet he also recognizes that war is necessary. And if he's going to apply the rationale of Lord of the Rings and actually apply it to historical events, so to speak, and that would inform his understanding of Lord of the Rings as being analogous in many ways to World War One and World War Two. I hope that isn't the case, but if that is the case, it's easier to read the New Shadow as some sort of meta commentary.
Yeah, I can't see like just the World War One starting his creation and or why he's writing or like working through some trauma or something like that. Because you're right, he's not really anti-war. He's just anti the bad things that happen in war, anti the loss of people, just like sort of the rational reasons for not wanting war to happen, not wanting bad things to happen, period. I mean, not you know, Frodo is very often questioning why this has happened to him, why has the ring come to me, and Tolkien's answers usually are providence through Gandalf's speeches.
But providence in and of itself is a much debated topic within the whole context, not only of the scholarship and the commentary beyond the stories themselves, but also within the context of the stories themselves, as it should be.
What do you
So
mean? Sorry.
what will you understand the idea of fate and providence and how much all of these events are being willed into existence, or how much individual agency effectively is informing these events? And then we understand that we can't exactly draw the line between one ends and where the other one begins, which is an obvious point really to make.
Mhm.
But yes, I think obviously that has informed quite a lot of my own understanding of this topic, is to what extent is this indicative of something which is beyond the story of the legendarium towards a genuine pessimism which is infecting Tolkien's thoughts on the state of what was then modern Britain in the 1960s and 1970s. But I really don't want to overstate that. Like I said, you can read both side by side and you can draw conclusions from both. Yet it would be unfair to reduce all of these points down to one explanation or the other.
Yes, and let's just talk a little about like outside of or sort of what Tolkien kind of alludes outside of the fourth or in the fourth age, but outside of the New Shadow, just sort of in the appendices at the end. I just think there's a lot of interesting stuff that he puts forward in his timeline at the end. One of the things that is interesting is sort of the dwarves um, have a come back. They will eventually retake Khazad-dûm. They will reclaim Moria in the fourth age, but it is sort of their eucatastrophe. Their things are going to decline extremely fast, probably for them afterwards.
Well, yes, I mean, with on the one hand, it mirrors the recreation of Arnor. We are going to restore these mountain kingdoms. I mean, all of the stories really regarding the dwarves, so in some senses mirroring what's happening with the kingdoms of men, because the story of Thorin Oakenshield is basically the story of Aragorn Elisar, effectively. I will return to my kingdom under the mountain, and I will try not to be corrupted by either the Arkenstone or the ring, effectively, or fall to the madness of wealth and gold. When it comes to the restoration of the kingdoms of the dwarves, as you know, and as people listening to this will know, if there is a sin to be associated with the dwarves, it is the sin of greed. And that means that there is a very short time frame associated with all of their domains, because eventually they will either dig too deeply and they will destroy themselves, or they will basically effectively plunder all of these areas for their wealth and basically leave them dormant and exhausted effectively. So, yes, there is the love of gaining materials and creating crafts, but there is a transitory nature inherent in the idea of the dwarven kingdoms, which means eventually these will all collapse in a certainty which perhaps doesn't necessarily even befall the Manish kingdoms. And that is why I think if you look at this from the perspective of the Silmarillion, the elves and their story is concluded almost in a hopeful manner, a bittersweet manner, which is the rejection of Middle Earth. Yet at the same time, it seems that the dwarves and their story, reflecting that of man, seems to be simply they're destined to fall down the path of more of the same.
Yes. Now, one element also of the sort of the restorations, or um the eucatastrophe, sort of the goodness that comes from the end of the Lord of the Rings in the Fourth Age. I think a perfect example of this is sort of how Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn more or less come together to create a better world, using their different talents. Obviously, uh, Aragorn representing men, Legolas uh, representing elves, and Gimli dwarves. But the dwarves rebuild the gates of Minas Tirith. Legolas plants gardens in the city, and as well as he creates sort of an enclave of elves in Ithilien, while Gimli uh, becomes the lord of the Glittering Caves in Rohan. It seems like that's sort of the highest point, or one of the highest points of sort of the collaboration of men, elves, and dwarves, sort of the children of Iluvatar in the beginning of the Fourth Age. But this contrasts with sort of the depression that comes with the new shadow.
So you understand the point perfectly, don't you? That at the very moment that Gimli and Legolas are pondering, their return to cross over the sea to the Undying Lands, at that moment everything begins to fall apart. um, yeah, I can understand why Tolkien didn't go through with it.
Yes, it kind of the sort of the end of the fourth, or the beginning of the Fourth Age, with sort of the contrasted by the new shadow. Really, it is quite depressing. Like the him declaring that it is depressing. It's almost like that's what he's thinking about. He's thinking about the sort of these elements, and just Aragorn returning to the new Northern Kingdom, which, to be honest, that's kind of one of those things that I would have liked more information about, like just kind of what that looked like, what a restoration of Arnor would have really looked like.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think you'll agree with me here. I would have loved to have seen a not a Lord of the Rings story. I mean, I know there are games and things that refer to this, but a full realization about the original fall of the Kingdom of Arnor to the Witch King. I think that would have perhaps been more interesting than the restoration of Arnor, because if anything,
Yes,
having a story like that, which is fully realized narratively rather than historically, would have perhaps made the restoration of Arnor seem more significant.
true. Well, if he had written that and then kind of had an appendices just of like how the things were restored, kind of could have given exactly what you're saying, and kind of the inclination or the desire that I have as well. And that would fit together really well. At least I think so.
Well, that story would be far more satisfying than a story on the inevitability of mankind's downfall and evil, despite the wonderful sort of recreation that we achieved after defeating Sauron.
Yes. But one of the really interesting ways is how they sort of incorporate the hobbits into the Northern Kingdom. They are now the counselors of the Northern King, which we don't get any others. So it's almost like the hobbits are the only counselors. Presumably there are more, or there would be, men, or, like Barlwin Butterbur or something as a counselor, though he'd be kind of an odd, probably not the best counselor. And one of the interesting things, and this reminds me of just sort of English history, or, sort of the um, giving out knighthoods or something. Sam was given the Star of the Dunedain as like a symbol of Aragorn's appreciation of Sam's loyalty and work. And his daughter Eleanor became a maid of honor to Queen Arwen. Do you think this is just sort of an example of, I don't know, English practices?
Well, I think tying this back to the idea of the new shadow, obviously this is taking place after the scouring of the Shire. And one of the things you can say about the scouring of the Shire is that it forces the hobbits to be political. One of the idyllic facets of the Shire is that it is almost entirely depoliticized. They have an ancient association with the Kingdom of Arnor, but effectively, the Dunedain realm, and they basically act as the not, I wouldn't even say political arbiters, but basically the notion of defense is simply there, outsourced in a very sort of um, elusive fashion. And in this case, you can say the hobbits actively participating in the restoration and the rituals of the new kingdom of the north. You can almost hope for it to be a short-term solution, that this is simply a recognition of what the hobbits have achieved, that the hobbits are, in fact, you can say now disproportionately, a very important factor in building up the Kingdom of Arnor, because the Shire actually exists as a tangible entity, unlike the kingdoms of men in the north at that time. But I guess my hope, in terms of the realization of the promises of the Fourth Age, is after 100 years, that there is a restoration to the idyllic, depoliticized nature of the Shire and the legacy of the Scouring. And in the same way, for the Kingdom of Arnor, the legacy of the destitution of Fornost and the arrival and desolation which is caused at the hands of the Kingdom of Angmar. For Arnor, the situation is perpetrated by the Witch King. In the case of the Shire, is perpetrated by Sharky. I look at this and I try and look at a situation in the Fourth Age reversing all of these things and looking at these political associations with the rituals and the intertwining of the hobbits into the institutions of men as a temporary thing that will eventually unravel, not in a negative way, but simply in the state that these are simply so organic that these formal associations are no longer needed. So when I look at the new shadow, I almost see this as a story of the scouring of the Shire writ large to incorporate the kingdoms of men. And
Mm.
that's why I find it so depressing.
Yes, though oddly enough, that sounds like a really good story. In the context of the Scouring the Shire, it's probably one of the a really great chapter within Lord of the Rings.
Indeed. And the question is, we've already had that, to some extent. So, like I said, I mean, this all comes down to intention, the legacy of the Lord of the Rings, etc., and thematically and in terms of genre, how much, Tolkien could have written this if he wanted. It could have been directed at a more mature audience, unlike The Hobbit, say, for example. It could have been interesting. But like I said, if you, I'll just take Star Wars as a comparison because it's the most obvious example. You can take something like Star Wars and you can say that the original films were basically a basic story of good and evil, light and dark side effect, blah, blah, blah. And then you take something like Andor, which is a relatively interesting exploration in terms of the mechanics of actually building an intergalactic empire. And that could be interesting. Maybe something like that could exist within the Lord of the Rings universe. But then you also have the possibility of seeing all of these other iterations in terms of the exploitation of that IP, where it's basically just complete rubbish, as you know, with all of these shows being turned out. So, yes, it may be interesting, but also be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, though I do think Tolkien was kind of a, very consistent writer, more so than any other writer that we usually talk about that is as prolific. Why can't I say that word? Um. Anyways, I feel like if he actually wrote it, I think anybody or almost anybody else writing it would be pretty much a, would be a perversion, would bring about a perversion of some kind.
And I
Um,
would include Christopher Tolkien in that, unfortunately. No, in an ideal world, Tolkien would have realized all of these things on the scale of Lord of the Rings. Alas, he didn't.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I had a sneaking suspicion that you felt that way about Christopher Tolkien's work.
Well, I just want to actually just really underline what I mean here. From an academic point of view, Christopher Tolkien's work has been entirely invaluable, in terms of actually doing the research, going through all of his father's notes, transcribing them, writing them down, comparing them. I mean, the history of Middle Earth as a resource is invaluable, and the work he's started is continuing onwards with the nature of Middle Earth, which was brought out recently, and even some of the edited books. So, for example, a recent compilation about his works on Arthurian legend, J.R. Tolkien's works on Arthurian legend, were recently released as an edited
mm,
version. So, in terms of Tolkien's studies, Christopher Tolkien is absolutely invaluable. My issue with Christopher Tolkien is with the Silmarillion specifically as being misrepresented as a work by J.R.R. Tolkien and not edited by Christopher Tolkien, effectively. And I don't therefore hold anything against him, but rather I think um, we're not talking about the Lord of the Rings turning into a pure epic in the sense that we have generations of writers being handed down the same stories and then reinterpreting them. Um, I think in the case of Christopher Tolkien, it was simply impossible. He wasn't up to it, and ultimately, the ultimate blame has to be with J.R.R. Tolkien for not having finished it in the first place.
yes. Interesting. You mentioned Andor as an example of sort of, an I or a series or an IP sort of changing vastly of, what type of story it is going, instead of just being good versus evil. I don't know why, but I watched Andor. When I watched Andor, I was kind of bored. I don't know if you liked it. I know it was probably more popular than most Disney Star Wars things, but I was kind of bored.
I mean, on a scale of one to 10, if I were to include, I know this is a topic of Lord of the Rings, but anyway, why not? If this is like a commentary on Disney Star Wars, if Disney Star Wars is mostly a 2 out of 10, I would say Andor is a good 6, which is very high praise considering how everything else seems to be verging on between like a 1 and a 3. But there we are.
Well, did you enjoy? I mean, this is the last thing about Star Wars, but did you enjoy Andor as like as a show?
I didn't. I didn't love it. I mean, it was
Okay.
okay. It
Yeah.
was more that I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't awful.
Okay, that yeah, I guess that's if you're looking at it like that, I think like that's kind of what some people are looking at the Rings of Power too. Like I've just heard some reviews, though I haven't seen season 2, though I've seen sort of some reviews of it, but that season 2 was just better than season 1, but not by much, just like a little bit better. And they're just getting like some people are happy with sort of a with, oh, they did that all right, somewhat they did that better than I thought they would have, which is just like the low expectations that everyone
I
has.
think the Rings of Power is doomed though, because in the same way that I'm being a purist and saying that Christopher Tolkien cannot present Tolkien again, he can only present an interpretation based on a hodgepodge of collected works which he has selected. Take that, and also take the material that he has access to, and then ascribe far less material to people who are far less invested and far less talented by a magnitude of about 1,000%, then you arrive at the Rings of Power.
Yeah. I mean, we did a whole episode with Charles Coulomb before the Rings of Power came out, just kind of discussing the sort of what it was giving off, what the trailers, and what the people behind it were saying, and obviously it was going to be a disaster long before it ever hit the screen, or even probably long before it started production. I mean, it was just set up to be disaster. Uh, and it's kind of funny. I saw an article. I didn't read the article, but I just saw the title because I just looked. I was looking for an image to use for the podcast about regarding the new Shadow, and I really couldn't find anything that was just related to the new Shadow or something like that, because obviously it's 13 pages and there's not much art about it or anything like that. So I just used an image of Minas Tirith basically as the thumbnail. But one of the things that came up was that it was this the story, the new Shadow, could be a good TV show basically. And I mean, not that like they have a lot to go on, but this type of story, the less magical element almost does seem like it would have way better potential. Though, of course, it has like literally 13 pages, so you can't really make a story off of that. But still,
Well, the last comment I can really make on this stream and the fourth age is to
mhm,
say that if you were or if I was suspicious that the story may have been pessimistic had Tolkien fully realized it, we can be thankful at least that had that TV show come out, we would have known it was going to be pessimistic and miserable and pointless. At least with the fourth age as conceived of at the end of the Lord of the Rings, we can have hope in a way that the TV show would have come along and dashed our hopes for everything.
indeed. Though I think every time that Tolkien publishes something, it's always more optimistic than the things he wrote that are unpublished.
Yes, maybe we're talking about the published author versus the unpublished author.
Because like the unpublished author, it's always kind of a sort of thing about like the I don't know. It's kind of like it's the people that like George R. R. Martin stuff versus people, versus Tolkien. Like their criticism is like people don't die, or like there's not enough tragedy or something like that. I'm just thinking about all his unpublished works and the amount of tragedy that takes place
I mean, if
off.
you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, didn't you, about there not being that many managed stories? Well, if you want to dredge up a managed story, then why don't you talk about the tragedy of Turin Bar?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's the darkest. Have you ever listened to that Children of Hurin was done by Christopher Lee?
Yes, I have a version of it.
Okay, yeah, that to me that's sort of, it's such an, I mean, it's one of his more full, Silmarillion stories, at least from my understanding. And it's quite grim comparison wise, but of course he never published it. So I just think that it seems like, we have The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Those are the two published, and they're surprisingly optimistic. And then everything else.
Well, Turin Bar is basically Tolkien's reimagining of the story of Oedipus. But when it comes down to it, it suffers from the same problem that I think the new Shadow does, which is Turin Bar is a story of essentially evil without deliverance. And that is something that Tolkien doesn't seem to be able to resolve when it comes to his explicitly managed stories, but he has been able to resolve in terms of his grand EU catastrophe in The Lord of the Rings.
Do you think, in some sense, especially with the elves, I feel like he's able to resolve it with elves, and generally, it's because elves have a place there's not as much, obviously it's said sort of that the men leave the world of Arda, like, and go beyond, and sort of that element of not knowing where they're heading. Do you think that's part of it?
Yes, I think that's exactly. I think you're completely correct. In fact, if you're going to make this as simple as possible, the story of the elves is that they leave Eden and then they return to it. In the case of man, the issue is that the third theme upon which Eru Luvatar creates man is only known to him. And that, of course, is not only Tolkien making a commentary on his own universe, but Tolkien is also making a commentary upon man as existing in this world as well. So, if Tolkien can't understand it, then we can only ever aspire to take a stab at it.
Well said. Well, I think that's where we should leave it about the new shadow in the fourth age. It's been a really great conversation, AM. Thanks for coming on and talking about this with me.
No, I'm very happy to have done so, and thank you for having invited me.
If you want to check out our previous episode, feel free. It's on the YouTube. It's on YouTube. We talk about the Third Age and get more detail about the wizards and their place in Middle Earth. And I think that's also an enjoyable conversation. If you're looking for something historical, I did a recent 2-part series about James II with Justine Brown. So please feel free to check that out. And if you want to get spicy, AM and I did a conversation about Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Pat Buchanan. So if which that's an episode. I don't know if you've noticed this, AM. You probably haven't been looking, but because of analytics and stuff, I noticed that when the whole controversy in Martyr Made, that became a little more popular again.
It's part of the reason why I won't touch Churchill, actually. the fear of being churned up unexpectedly in the algorithm. But it's interesting you mentioned that video, because it's actually, in a bizarre way, rather pertinent if we're talking about Tolkien's meta-commentary on World War II to bring up that video.
It is. It's just Tolkien's view on World War II probably is not the same as Pat Buchanan's. Would you say?
It's too big a question for me really to answer.
Okay.
And I'll leave it at that.
It's more of a theory. I don't know if it's in it. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it would be. So, but I just kind of have a feeling they're a little different minded there. Thank you everyone for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and God bless. Also, check out AM's videos. AM, what's anything coming in the near future that you want to plug?
Related to this, not really. The last thing I did was a conversation about how Christians were being genocided in the Middle East. So if you really want an exciting, happy, we talk about pessimism quite a lot on the stream, but if you want to understand the extent of pessimism that I'll be able to get into, then maybe that's the stream for you.
And if you want pessimism on the British monarchy, go on your republicanism. Was it the necessariness of
something like that? Yeah.
Necessary evil of republicanism in England.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, check those out. I mean, anything on AM's channel is, great to listen to. So, thank you everyone for watching, and God bless. Bye.
Bye.